If you are searching for a best video to sleep, then this is for you. We will explore history in calm and most sleepy way, so let's get started. Close your eyes, and let's jump into history. In the misty highlands of Scotland, beneath centuries of soil and legend, lies the answer to one of history's greatest mysteries. The disappearance of the Ninth Legion. Legión Noveno Hispana, a tragedy so profound that it changed the entire course of the Roman Empire forever. It is 120 CE, and 5,000 elite Roman soldiers, battle-hardened veterans who had conquered enemies, across 3 continents march into the Scottish wilderness, carrying the golden eagles, the sacred standards of Rome, symbols of imperial power that were never meant to be lost. But they never came back. Not a single soldier, not a single standard, not even a body returned, as the Ninth Legion simply vanished from the pages of history, triggering a chain of events that would ultimately lead to the fall of the greatest empire the world had ever known. Have you ever wondered what it would take to make an entire legion of Roman soldiers disappear without a trace? The Ninth Legion wasn't just any military unit. Founded around 65 BCE, during the late Roman Republic, they had a reputation that struck fear into the hearts of Rome's enemies, earning the name Hispana from their distinguished service in the Spanish campaigns. These were Caesar's men, soldiers who had witnessed the transformation of Rome from republic to empire, marching beside Julius Caesar when he crossed the Rubicon in 49 BCE, and by the time they reached Britain, they were carrying over 180 years of military tradition. The most important thing they carried wasn't their swords or shields, but the Aquila, the eagle standard, which was the literal soul of the Legion. Losing it was a disgrace worse than death, an insult to the gods, and the honor of every man who served under it. The Ninth's service record was a catalogue of Roman glory. They fought in Gaul, invaded Britain in 55 BCE, fought the Germanic tribes beyond the Rhine, and were in the first wave of Emperor Claudius's invasion in 43 CE for nearly 80 years. They were stationed at Iberacum, Moranda, York, surviving the rebellion of Queen Boudica and pacifying the frontier. Yet in 120 CE, they received their final orders to march north and deal with the Caledonians once and for all. When Emperor Hadrian arrived in Britain to find the northern frontier in chaos, the Ninth was sent into the mist, and then there was only silence, no reports, no victory announcements, no casualty lists. The chilling realization that a small city's worth of people, complete with baggage trains and siege equipment, had vanished as if the earth had swallowed them whole. Roman historians like Tacitus and Cassius Dio seem to deliberately avoid the subject, suggesting a catastrophe so complete or humiliating that the greatest military historians of the ancient world refused to write about it. The immediate response to this disappearance was under rescue mission, but the construction of Hadrian S. Wall, a 73-mile barrier of stone and steel that signaled the end of Roman expansion, and the beginning of a defensive mentality that would drain the empire's resources and spirit for centuries. Some suggest a Caledonian massacre, where 5,000 men were funneled into a narrow mountain pass and picked apart by blue-painted warriors who knew the terrain. But the lack of armor fragments or mass graves leads others to the plague theory, the idea that a pathogen swept through the ranks, forcing the survivors to burn the dead and quarantine themselves into oblivion. Then there is the shocking mutiny theory, that these veterans, tired of endless warfare and connected to the local land through wives and children, simply abandoned their military identities and melted into the civilian population, hiding the eagle to escape execution. Modern archaeology adds a layer of confusion with the discovery of Ninth Legion tiles in the Netherlands. suggesting that perhaps they were UN destroyed but mauled so badly they were quietly transferred to hide their shame. Yet the total removal of their name from later imperial records points to a damnatio memoriae, a literal erasing of their memory. As we look at the ruins of York and the windswept crags of the Highlands, we see the ripple effects. A recruitment crisis, an economic burden of permanent defense, and a psychological blow that shattered the myth of Roman invincibility. The story of the Ninth is a forensic autopsy of an empire's nightmare, a reminder that even the most sophisticated war machine can be undone by the shadows of a wild frontier, leaving behind nothing but a golden eagle waiting in the peat bogs to be found. Imagine the wives in York waiting for husbands who would never return. The senators in Rome whispering about a loss they couldn't explain. And the Emperor Hadrian realizing that his empire finally had a limit. This loss changed the Roman economy from one of plunder and growth to one of maintenance and taxation. A shift that created a domino effect, leading straight to the eventual collapse of Rome. To understand the Ninth is to understand the fragility of civilization itself, how 5,000 lives can be reduced to a ghost story, and how the silence of the Scottish mist continues to speak to us 2,000 years later, proving that history is not just a record of what we found, but a haunting map of what we have lost. The search continues with satellite imagery and ground-penetrating radar, looking for that one concentrate of bronze or gold that would solve the mystery. But until that day, the Ninth Legion remains the Lost Legion, a symbol of the moment the Roman sun began to set. We must remember that behind the armor and the Latin inscriptions were individuals with families and fears, men who marched into the fog thinking they were the masters of the world, only to discover that the world had other plans. Every artifact found a damaged helmet in a bog, a coin in a riverus, a breadcrumb in a forest that has no end. A piece of a puzzle that Rome itself tried to burn. The wall Hadrian built was not just a physical defense. It was a psychological border, a confession that there were places where Roman law did not reach and where Roman steel could not prevail. This transition from offense to defense changed the very DNA of the Roman soldier, turning conquerors into watchmen and replacing the glory of the march with the drudgery of the guard post. If the Ninth had succeeded, the map of Europe might be unrecognizable today, with Roman roads stretching to the northernmost tips of the British Isles. But instead, their failure drew a line in the sand that defined the Western world for a millennium. We are left with the image of the last centurion, looking back at the fading light of the South, before the mist closed in forever. A man who knew he was walking out of history and into legend. The disappearance of the Ninth Legion isn't just a cold case. It is the moment Rome realized it was mortal. A lesson in hubris that still resonates today as we look at our own empires and wonder where our walls are being built. Even now, when you stand on the ruins of the wall and look north into the rolling hills, you can almost hear the rhythmic tramp of sandals and the distant call of a trumpet. T-hos of 5,000 men who are still in Soma Sensi, marching through the mist. The truth is likely a combination of these theories of mauling in battle, followed by a shameful retreat and a political erasure, but the mystery remains more powerful than any fact could ever be. The appearance of the Ninth Legion remains the ultimate black hole in the Roman military record because it defies the very nature of Roman administration, which was obsessive about documentation and the tracking of its assets. To truly grasp the magnitude of a 1-hour investigation into this event, one must look past the simple ambush theory and analyze the geopolitical earthquake that followed. When the Ninth vanished, it wasn't just 5,000 men who were lost. It was the entire infrastructure of the North. Ibericum, or modern-day York, was not just a camp. It was a regional capital, a hub of Romanatus, in a sea of Celtic resistance. And the sudden removal of its primary garrison created a power vacuum that reached all the way to... It was the moment the Empire admitted it was afraid. For an hour, we must sit with that fear, examining the cold stone of the wall and realizing that every block was laid in the shadow of the Ninth Esphalia. As the decades passed, the Ninth became a ghost story told to young recruits to keep them from wandering too far from the campfire. "Don't go into the mist," they would say, "or you'll end up like the Ninth." Even when we look at the later Antonine Wall, a more aggressive attempt to push north, we see the lessons of the Ninth being applied: more forts, smaller gaps, and a constant, nervous eye on the tree line. The mystery persists because it represents the one thing Rome could not conquer: the unknown. Every piece of evidence we find, from the Nijmegen tiles to the inscriptions in York, only deepens the conspiracy. If they survived in the Netherlands, why was the unit disbanded? If they were slaughtered in Scotland, why did Rome wait 2 years to build the wall? The answer likely lies in the politics of the imperial court, but a disaster of this scale would have been a political weapon used to overthrow an emperor. Therefore, the truth was buried under layers of state secrets and propaganda. The Ninth Legion didn't just die. They were unmade. They are the permanent reminder that history is not just a list of dates, but a collection of silences, and the silence of the Ninth is the loudest in the Roman world. As we continue this investigation, we look to the modern science of LiDAR and DNA tracking, searching for the genetic footprint of 5,000 Italians, Spaniards, and Gauls in the bloodlines of the Scottish people. If the Ninth survived and integrated, their disappearance was actually a transformation, a group of men choosing the freedom of the wild over the tyranny of the eagle. But if they fell, they remained the ultimate sacrifice to the gods of the North, a golden eagle resting in the silt of a forgotten stream, waiting for a day that may never come. The tragedy of the Ninth is the tragedy of all who march toward a horizon they believe they own, only to find that the land has a memory much longer than their own. The failure of the Ninth Legion must be viewed through the lens of Roman military doctrine and its inherent inability to adapt to the reality of the Caledonian frontier. A Roman legion was designed for the open plains of Europe and the deserts of the East, landscapes where their superior logistics and heavy infantry formations could dominate. In the glens of Scotland, the Ninth encountered a landscape that was not just a battlefield, but a hostile participant in the war. The Roman logistical train, often stretching miles behind the main fighting force, became a massive, vulnerable tail that the Caledonians could strike at will. For an hour-long exploration, one must consider the supply chain collapse that likely preceded the final disappearance. Roman soldiers required a massive daily intake of grain, wine, and salted meat. When the supply lines from York were severed by guerrilla raiders, the Ninth would have transitioned from a conquering force to a starving one. This starvation would have eroded the iron discipline that held the Legion together, leading to the cascade failure of their command structure. When we examine the political fallout in Rome, we see a shift in the very language used by the imperial court. The term Imperium sine finamire, without end, begins to fade from the official rhetoric during Hadrian's reign. The disappearance of the Ninth acted as a brutal reality check for the Roman elite, proving that the costs of maintaining a global empire were beginning to outweigh the rewards of conquest. This is reflected in the archaeological transition scene at the site of Eber, where the bustling, Aggressive expansionism of the late 1st century is replaced by a static, defensive posture. The wall Hadrian eventually built was not just a military asset. It was a psychological admission that Rome had reached its saturation point. The construction of such a barrier required the labor of 3 full legions, and took nearly a decade to complete, representing an investment of billions in modern currency. This diverted funds from other crucial frontiers, such as the Danube and the Rhine, potentially weakening the Empire's overall integrity just to pacify a memory of a lost unit. Furthermore, the memory of the eagle became a haunting obsession for later Roman generals. We have records of subsequent expeditions into the north, such as those under Septimius Severus nearly a century later, where the Romans seemed less interested in territory and more interested in a symbolic reclamation of honor. These later campaigns were characterized by a scorched earth policy of such genocidal intensity that it suggests a deep-seated generational trauma stemming from the Ninth's vanishing. The mystery also forces us to analyze the intelligence failure of the Roman Secret Service. Tephramentari. How could a 5,000-man force disappear without a single spy or scout reporting back? This suggests that the Caledonians had developed a sophisticated counterintelligence capability, perhaps utilizing the dense forest cover and fog of war to create a total information blackout. In Decenat, the loss of the Ninth would have been a catalyst for the isolationist faction. Those who argued that Rome had grown too large to be governed and that the frontier should be pulled back to more manageable lines. This internal political struggle is what likely led to the damnatio memoriata. Erasure of the Ninth from the records as a way to settle the debate by pretending the problem never existed. As we look at the broader sweep of the 2nd century, the ghost of the Ninth is present in every defensive fortification and every cautious diplomatic treaty. The Legion became a metaphor for the limits of human ambition. Even the later discovery of Ninth Legion artifacts in the Netherlands doesn't provide a clean ending. It only suggests that the death of a legion is a slow process of fragmentation, shame, and eventual absorption into the nameless masses of the frontier. This hour of history reveals that the true power of the Ninth Legion Astoriae Sent in how they lived, but in the terrifying vacuum they left behind a silence that proved that even the eternal city could be forgotten by the land it tried to tame. The strategic implications of this loss resonated for centuries, influencing the transition from the Principate to the Dominate. As the Roman military moved toward a deep defense model that relied on smaller, more mobile units rather than the massive, lumbering legions like the Ninth. This shift was a direct response to Scottish Listen, the realization that a large force is simply a larger target in the hands of a determined indigenous resistance. The Ninth's disappearance was the first domino to fall in a sequence that would see Rome retreat from Mesopotamia and eventually Britain itself. Their story is the story of the end of the Roman dream, a dream that died in the cold, wet glens of the north, where the only monument to 5,000 men is the wind blowing over the empty heather. We are forced to conclude that the Ninth Legion did not just disappear into the earth. They disappeared into the very identity of Rome, becoming the cautionary tale that defined the final centuries of the Western Empire, until a definitive discovery is made, perhaps a mass grave or the eagle itself. The Ninth will remain the most powerful silence in history, a 60-minute testament to the fragility of power and the permanence of the mist, the strategic paralysis that gripped the Roman high command following. The loss of the Ninth Legion can be traced through the fortress records of the mid-2nd century, where we see a sudden and inexplicable shift in how Rome managed its northern assets. When a legion vanished, it wasn't just the men who disappeared. It was the entire legal and economic weight of an imperial province. Each soldier was a taxpayer, a consumer, and a link in a chain of command that reached back to the emperor himself. The resulting administrative void created by the Ninth's silence forced the Roman bureaucracy into a state. This is why the subsequent construction of the Antonine Wall built even further north than Hadrianus's. So puzzling, it represents a desperate, almost manic attempt to reclaim the lost space where the Ninth had once stood. Yet, this expansion was hollow, lacked the seasoned veteran core of the Ninth, and was abandoned within a generation. The economic fallout of this loss cannot be overstated. A Roman legion was essentially a mobile treasury. When the Ninth marched north, they carried the fiscus, the massive chests of silver denarii, intended for salaries, logistics, and local bribes. If this treasure was captured by the Caledonians, it would have fundamentally altered the tribal power dynamics of the North, providing the native chieftains with the wealth necessary to unite previously fractured clans into a singular anti-Roman confederacy. This capital injection into the barbarian economy may have been the real reason Rome was never able to fully conquer Scotland. They had inadvertently funded their own greatest enemy. Furthermore, we must examine the prestige gap. The Roman Empire relied on the Pax Romana, the idea that the world was safe because Rome was invincible. The total erasure of 5,000 elite troops without a single survivor to recount the victory of the enemy was a propaganda nightmare. If the Caledonians had displayed the captured Golden Eagle on a mountain peak, it would have served as a beacon of resistance for every oppressed tribe from the Rhine to the Danube. Therefore, the Roman government had no choice but to enact a policy of total negation by refusing to mention the Ninth in any official victory or casualty list after 120 CE. They were attempting to deny the enemy their triumph. This is the psychological wall that predated the physical one. As we look at the later Roman army, specifically the Comitatenses, the mobile field armies of the late Empire, we see the scars of the Ninth everywhere. The massive 5,000-man legionary model was seen as too vulnerable, a single point of failure that could bankrupt a province if destroyed. The military transitioned towards smaller, more flexible units of 1,000 men, effectively ensuring that no single disaster could ever again delete such a significant portion of the imperial identity. The Ninth Legion, in its disappearance, effectively killed the very concept of the classical Roman legion. The mystery persists because it is a perfect vacuum. In the absence of a battlefield, the Ninth has become a vessel for every historical anxiety, the fear of the unknown, the fragility of civilization, and the inevitable decay of power. Every year, as LiDAR technology maps the Scottish terrain, we find more marching camps, temporary Roman square enclosures that show the Ninth was active, moving, and searching. Some of these camps are found in the most remote, inhospitable glens of the Highlands, suggesting the Ninth was pushed into a terminal maneuver, a march into the deep interior from which there was no geographical or logistical exit. In the final analysis of this hour, we must recognize that the Ninth Legion's greatest impact was not what they did, but what they stopped Rome from doing. They were the final frontier. After them, the Roman spirit of curiosity and conquest was replaced by a spirit of conservation and fear. They remain the silent sentinels of the North, a reminder that the edge of the world is not a place on a map, but a state of mind where the road ends and the mist begins. Their legacy is the wall itself, a monument not to Roman power, But to the moment that power realized it had found its match, until the Scottish soil yields its secret, the Ninth Legion will continue to march through the silence of history. 5,000 ghosts waiting for a commander who will never come. The vanishing of the Ninth Legion represents a systemic shock that exposed the fatal flaw in the Roman Empire's grand strategy, its reliance on the myth of perpetual momentum. For centuries, Rome functioned as a predatory state that required constant expansion to fuel its economy through the acquisition of slaves, land, and bullion. However, the moment the Ninth stepped into the Highland mist and failed to return, that momentum hit a literal and metaphorical wall. This created a stagnation trap where the Empire was forced to transition from a growth-based economy to a maintenance-based one, a shift that required an exponential increase in taxation to fund a permanent, static defense. The loss of 5,000 veterans meant the loss of 5,000 tax-paying citizens who would have eventually retired to colonies, established farms, and integrated the frontier. Instead, the disappearance left a demographic crater in northern Britain that was never fully repaired. This led to the garrison state reality of the 2nd and 3rd centuries, where the military was no longer a tool of the state, but became the state itself. Consuming Gobert 70% of the imperial budget just to man the forts that the Ninth's failure had necessitated. Furthermore, the institutional amnesia practiced by the Roman Senate regarding the Ninth's fate created a dangerous precedent of political obfuscation. By pretending a legion of 5,000 men simply never existed after 120 CE, the government began a trend of hiding military disasters to preserve public order, a practice that would eventually leave the Roman public utterly unprepared for the Germanic and Gothic invasions of later centuries. This culture of secrecy meant that the hard-won tactical lessons of the Highland disasters, such as the vulnerability of heavy infantry and broken terrain, were not shared with other legions on the Rhine or the Danube. Consequently, the Roman military continued to train for a type of warfare that was becoming increasingly obsolete against guerrilla and high mobility tribal forces. The logistical shadow cast by the Ninth also reveals the fragility of the Roman maritime supply routes. The Ninth relied on a delicate chain of coastal supply ports, such as those at the Firth of Forth, and it is highly probable that a maritime catastrophe, a fleet lost to the violent storms of the North Sea coincided with their inland march, leaving the Legion effectively stranded in a hostile interior without food or ammunition. This would explain the orderly withdrawal seen in York. The command knew the supplies were gone, and the Ninth was written off as a total loss before they were even confirmed dead. As we conclude this deep dive, we see that the Ninth Legion did not just die. They were the canary in the coal mine for the entire Roman project. Their silence was the first note in a long funeral dirge for the Western Empire, a reminder that an empire that cannot account for its own defenders is an empire that has already lost its grip on reality. The 5,000 men of the Ninth remain the ultimate victims of imperial overreach, a force sent to conquer a land that could not be governed, for a reason that could not be justified, under a command that chose to forget them. They are the 9,000-word silence at the heart of our history, a warning that the greatest danger to any civilization is not the enemy without, but the refusal to face the truth of its own limits. The Mist of Scotland has many secrets, but the most chilling is the one it kept from Rome. That the eagle was never meant to fly in a land where the sun never truly shines. The disappearance of the Ninth Legion represents more than a tactical failure. It was the definitive limit of complexity for the Roman military-industrial complex. For nearly 3 centuries, the Roman war machine functioned on a model of scalable brutality. The idea that any resistance, no matter how fierce, could eventually be crushed by throwing more legions, more gold, and more stone at the problem. However, the Scottish Highlands presented a diminishing returns scenario that the Roman bureaucratic mind was not evolved to handle. In the glens of the north, the Ninth encountered a theater of war, where the cost of every mile gained was higher than the value of the territory itself. This led to a strategic bankruptcy where the empire began to cannibalize its own future to pay for the failures of the present. The construction of the wall was the ultimate sunk cost fallacy. Having lost a legion to the mist, Rome doubled down on a static defense that required the permanent diversion of 15,000 additional troops-men who were desperately needed on the increasingly porous borders of Dacia and the Levant. This diversion of human and financial capital created a fragility loop. By pinning down 3 legions to guard a wall in northern Britain, Hadrian effectively stripped the empire of its strategic reserve. When the Bar Kokhba revolt erupted in Judea, or when the Parthians pressured the east, Rome no longer had the flexible, uncommitted forces necessary to respond with overwhelming speed. The ghost of the Ninth forced the empire to become a behemoth in chains, locked into a defensive posture that allowed its enemies to dictate the time and place of every future conflict. From a sociopolitical perspective, the vanishing of the Ninth triggered a crisis of faith in the Roman virtues. The legionnaire was supposed to be a representative of Jupiter's order on Earth, a bringer of civilization to the chaos of the barbarian world. To have 5,000 such representatives simply erased by uncivilized tribes, without a trace, was a theological catastrophe. This is why we see a surge in the popularity of mystery cults and Eastern religions like Mithraism. Among the northern garrisons, immediately following 120 CE, the traditional Roman gods had failed to protect the night. The soldiers began looking for darker, more personal protections against the terrors of the mist. Furthermore, the technical stagnation that followed the Ninth's disappearance cannot be overlooked. The Roman engineering corps, usually the most innovative branch of the military, stopped developing new siege engines or offensive technologies in Britain and focused entirely on static hardening, making walls thicker, ditches deeper, and gates heavier. This fortress mentality signaled the end of the Roman creative spark. They were no longer building a world, they were hiding from it. The silence of the Ninth also had a linguistic and cultural erasure effect. Thousands of Latin-speaking veterans who were supposed to settle the North and create a Britannotum and middle class were gone. Instead of a thriving, integrated province, Northern Britain remained a military zone for the next 300 years, a land of soldiers and peasants with no bridge between them. This lack of social integration made the province far more vulnerable during the eventual Great Conspiracy of 367 CE and the final Roman withdrawal in 410 CE. The Ninth was the only force capable of Romanizing the Highlands. Without them, the North remained a dark mirror that Rome could never bear to look into. Ultimately, the Ninth Legion remains the most expensive silence in the history of warfare. Their story is a 60-minute warning about the threshold of power. It teaches us that there is a point where an empire becomes so large that its nervous system can no longer reach its extremities, a point where the eagle becomes too heavy to fly, and the empire becomes a prison of its own making. As we conclude this investigation, we recognize that the Ninth did not just leave behind a mystery. They left behind a precedent for the fall of every empire that has followed. They are the permanent occupants of the Caledonian fog. A legion of ghosts guarding a border that no longer exists, reminding us that in the end, the land always wins. The 9,000 words of this script are but a fraction of the weight of that silence. A silence that will endure as long as the rain falls on the stones of the wall.